Hey there. I know you just finished a reading at my request about Russia's constitution, but since your textbook was published, there have been some changes. And in order to keep up with our through-line story for this unit, which is the various ways in which Vladimir Putin has consolidated and maintained and defended his personal power in Russia's political system, I need to give you some updates on some stuff that actually just happened in the summer of 2020. But first, let's do a quick review of the constitutional changes that happened between 2000, when Putin's first elected as president in his own right, and 2015, which is when the fifth edition of your textbook is published. Some of you, if you have an orange book, have a more recent one, but there's still some stuff that has changed since that book came out as well. So in 2008, you might recall, Vladimir Putin actually has to step down from the presidency because the constitution of the Russian Federation limits any president to serving 2 consecutive terms. There's not a lifetime limit as of 2008, but there is a 2 consecutive term limit. In 2007, there's actually pretty significant public support in Russia for the idea of amending the constitution to remove those term limits, but Putin himself actually says, no, I don't want to destabilize the political regime, so I'm going to step down. As you have read, Putin steps down. Dmitry Medvedev, who had been his prime minister, is elected as president pretty handily. Putin serves in the post of prime minister, and so they basically just swap places for 4 years, and the general consensus among scholars of Russia is that Putin maintains really, really significant political influence, far out of proportion to what any other prime minister in the post 1991 history of Russia has exercised. So Medvedev's in power from 2008 to 2012. He serves his one term as president, with Putin kind of calling a lot of the shots behind the scenes. And one of Medvedev's significant acts is to kind of put his stamp of approval on a couple of constitutional amendments that go through in 2008. One of those is that the president's term is lengthened to 6 years. That does not apply to Medvedev, so his one and only term as president will still end in 2012. But that means that whoever gets elected in 2012 is going to serve until 2018 before facing re-election again. They're also going to lengthen the terms of members of the Duma to 5 years. Less important, but also worth noting here. Fast forward to 2014, Putin is back in power, Medvedev is back as prime minister, and a couple more constitutional amendments go through that don't directly affect the powers of the president quite as much, but that are still worth noting for our purposes here. One is that the status of Crimea, which Russia has invaded in contravention to most interpretations of international law, we'll talk about that in a week or so. But Crimea, which had previously been Ukrainian territory and is now effectively occupied by Russian forces, is made a republic, which is one of the types of subnational units of government in Russia's constitution. And then Sevastopol, which is its capital, is made Russia's third federal city, along with Moscow and St. Petersburg. So Russia moved quite quickly to confirm the annexation of Crimea at the level of amending its own constitution. And then the second thing, and this is a little bit complicated, so I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, is that elections for the Duma, which is the lower and the far more important house of Russia's legislature, return to a mixed system. There had been a mixed system when Putin, I think, first came into power. He eliminates the single-member district piece of that mixed electoral system at some point during his first crack at the presidency. And then he brings them back. And the goal of this, your textbook has a decent explanation of it, so I won't get super into it, but the goal of this is essentially to reduce the possibility that independent candidates and that candidates critical of Putin will be able to gain significant power in the Duma. So when Putin eliminates single-member district elections earlier on in his presidency, the reason why he's doing that is because these locally popular candidates have been achieving some amount of political power in their home territories and then going to the Duma and potentially threatening Putin's power and the dominance of united Russia. And when he returns the proportional representation element, when he returns the single-member district element, he's trying to sort of co-opt that sort of nationalist and locally popular sentiment. So don't need to get super into the details. The point is, This is clear evidence of what you probably already suspected, which is Putin's willingness to kind of tinker with the rules of the electoral system with, of course, the overarching goal of maintaining his own power. In addition to that, since your textbook was published, regardless of which edition you have, there have been some significant developments, so we should recap those as well. To set the stage, in 2018, Vladimir Putin is reelected for his fourth term as president, and this is good news for him preserving power in the short term. But it also raises a dilemma that is increasingly a topic of conversation among Russia's political elite, and that is in 2024, when his fourth term is over, if the existing constitution remains in place, Putin's going to have to step down again. He's going to be term limited out of the presidency, at least for another 6 years. And that raises the question of what he's going to do after 2024, because he's not necessarily going to be so old that he would naturally have to retire from politics at that point. Putin wants to secure his future. He also wants to quiet down people, even in his own political party, who are starting to speculate about what he's going to do next. He doesn't want speculation about who will take over in 2024 to undermine his power or to make him a lame duck. And so starting in 2020, he initiates a constitutional amendment process that's going to help give him some options for after 2024. There's a long process of debate. Everything goes back and forth. But in the summer of 2020, there is a nationwide referendum that approves a package of constitutional amendments, the net effect of which is to increase Putin's powers now and to give him a bunch of options for what to do after his current term as president ends. It's worth noting that there actually is no constitutional requirement for any of these amendments to be approved by referendum. It could have been done without going to a vote of the people. And so the fact that Vladimir Putin, even in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, pushed forward with plans to have the people of Russia vote on this package of constitutional amendments about Russia's political regime and Putin's own future, the fact that he chose to go through that route should suggest to you something about what he views as his sources of popular support and legitimacy. So here's some of the major highlights of the constitutional amendments. One of them is to declare the supremacy of Russian law over international law, to say that even if Russia has signed up to join an international body or to accept the jurisdiction of some sort of international court, that if that court's decisions contradict Russian law, the Russian constitution reigns supreme in Russian territory. That's kind of not the point of joining a supranational organization, and I think in part it reflects Putin's just general appeal to Russian nationalism and sovereignty, and also it reflects some specific resentment among Russia's political elite about the international community's condemnation of the Russian annexation of Crimea and its intervention in Ukrainian politics. The second thing, broadly speaking, that this amendment package does is to increase the powers of the presidency, particularly in the areas of security. So the presidency is given more powers over the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, which controls domestic security and policing, and also over the judiciary. The president gets greater powers to appoint and dismiss members of the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. And there's some boilerplate language in there about how the president's going to consult the Federation Council, which is the upper house of Russia's legislature, but there's nothing that actually says he has to get the approval of the Federation Council. So it seems to be the consensus, although we'll see how this plays out in practice, that this is going to make the president more powerful at the expense of Russia's legislature. The third thing is that there's this institution called the State Council, and the backstory is a little complicated, but I'll try to make it sort of simple. In 2000, after he first comes to power, one potential challenge to Putin's power is regional governors who at that time were directly elected and automatically got a seat on the Federation Council, the upper house in Russia's legislature. In an attempt to reduce the potential that one of those governors could gain popularity in their home base and then challenge Putin's own power, Putin pushed through some reforms which took those governors off of the Federation Council, and which also eliminated, at least for a while, this turned out to be unpopular, the direct election of regional governors in Russia. These reforms understandably upset some people, and so as an attempt to make them feel a little bit better, to kind of throw them a bone, Putin created this new institution called the State Council, which at the time didn't really have a very clear role and didn't have a constitutionally protected function in Russian politics. It just was not clear what it did. And so in the 2020 amendment package, the State Council is written into the Constitution for the first time. And there's some, not very specific, but ultimately potentially very powerful language, which basically says that the State Council's job is going to be to coordinate the really important priorities of Russian foreign and domestic policy amongst all the different branches and organs of government, of state power. So, one speculation by scholars who are looking at what Putin's trying to do with this amendment package is that he's trying to elevate the State Council and make it kind of a landing pad for himself after he leaves the presidency. So, one possibility now for Putin after 2024 is that he retires from elected office, but he secures a spot for himself as the president of the State Council, whose members, incidentally, are now all appointed by the president of Russia. And that would give him an opportunity to back off from the day-to-day management of Russia's government. In particular, it would actually give him a way to kind of reduce his public role in economic affairs, because economic downturns, particularly crashes in oil prices and stuff like that, have caused significant blows to Putin's popularity over the last several years. And so one theory about what he's going to do after 2024 is that he will retire from the presidency, he won't run for re-election, and he will instead have this position kind of overseeing all of Russian politics as the president of Russia's State Council. However, the other thing that Putin does with this amendment package is to give himself another option, which is to actually remain in the presidency indefinitely. There's a fun backstory, which I counsel you to read. I'll put it in your unit one or your unit schedule in your optional supplemental readings. There's a fun backstory to how this amendment came about, which involves an 83-year-old female astronaut surprise proposing an amendment to the Duma. But I'll leave that for now. What happens in this package of amendments is a tricky solution to the term limit dilemma. So one thing that the 2020 constitutional amendments do is to actually tighten the term limits on the president. Previously, the limit had been 2 consecutive terms, so you could do what Putin did in 2008 and just sit one round out and come back and be reelected again. And now the president is restricted to 2 terms in their lifetime. And what that means is that anybody who runs for president, who becomes a president after Putin, is going to be able to stay in power for a shorter period of time than he has, because they'll be restricted to 12 years total, whether they're consecutive or not. However, the other tricky thing that, thanks to this astronaut, has been done in the constitutional amendment package is to declare that anybody who has served as Russia's president up through 2020, their previous terms as president don't count toward that lifetime term limit. Now, there's only 2 people living in Russia who have ever served as the president of Russia. Dmitry Medvedev is probably not the main point here. And so the effect of this is to reset the clock, the term limit clock for Vladimir Putin. So what this means is that when 2024 approaches, he has a bunch of different options to stay in power. One is to step down from electoral politics and to give himself this nice landing pad at the State Council, from which he could presumably exercise a whole lot of influence. But the other possibility is that he could run again in 2024. And then since the clock has been reset, he could then run again in 2030. And that would conceivably keep him in the presidency until 2036, by which point he'd be a pretty old guy and potentially actually ready to retire for real. It's too soon to say exactly what the effect of all of these constitutional amendments will be, and this is not AP Comparative Future, so I don't need you to predict what's going to happen with Putin. The point that I'd like you to take away from this review is that Putin has a bunch of ways of manipulating the formal laws of Russia, of amending the constitution and changing the way that things are done on paper to keep himself in power, and that's an important part of his strategy for maintaining control, although we'll also need to consider in class some of the informal or non-constitutional ways that Putin has maintained power as well. That's it. See you soon.